Welcome back. In this video, we're going to finally set up navigation with Compose, and I thought it was time to look at the documentation once again, because there is a guide as to how to do navigation with Compose, and you can check it out. It's a quite good documentation. You can see the Kotlin code. So the first thing that it says we should use is an implementation inside of our dependencies. So we need to add that into our build.gradle file, the app modules build.gradle file. All right, so let's go ahead and just do that. Therefore, let's copy this piece, well, actually just this piece of code here, and go over to our project. And there inside of the module Gradle, you will find the dependencies. Okay, so now in here we can add our dependencies. So the nav version 2.7.4 is the current version, and then the implementation with the navigation Compose. So I would recommend you use this exact same version in our videos, not use the version that will be displayed here, because that will change over time and potentially break whatever we have built. So sometimes it just happens, and that's why I would recommend that you use the same versions as I do. So then we need a NavController. Well, all right, let's do that. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go over to our, well, first of all, let's sync this file, this Gradle projects file. Otherwise, the navigation will not appear as selectable options and stuff like that. So that will take a little while, and let's just do its thing. Once it's done, we can get back to it, because we really don't want to run into the situation where the Gradle is syncing and we're editing some other code in the meantime and then something breaks. So it doesn't have to happen, but it's not unlikely that it might happen, and then suddenly your application will not work properly. So let's wait for that bit. All right, so it took roughly a minute in my case. It might take a little longer for you, depends on a few things like internet speed and speed of your computer. So I'm going to, inside of my main activity, set up my app. Set up a new composable. So add composable, and I'm gonna call this one fun my app, or like this, my app with a capital M. And then inside of this my app, that's where I'm going to set up this NavController that we just saw. So this one here, the NavController, remember NavController. So the NavController is the central API for the navigation component. It is stateful and keeps track of the backstack of composables that make up the screens in your app and the state of each screen. So what is the backstack? The backstack is basically whenever you open a new screen and you click back, the back button on your phone, then it will go and send you back to the screen that led to the current screen, basically. So what that does is basically it stacks up. So if you go from one screen, so screen 1 to screen 2 to screen 3, and you click the back button, then it goes from screen 3 to screen 2. So it stores the screens that were used and the order in which you used those screens for your back button to send you to the right screen, because otherwise you want to go back potentially, and then it sends you to a different screen and you're confused because that's not what the behavior that you're used to. Okay, so that's what this backstack does. Okay, so we have this remember a NavController, and now we need to set up a NavHost. So the NavHost requires a NavController, which is why we set up this NavController, and then we can pass that NavController to the NavHost, and we need to define what the start destination is. So basically saying which composable, so which screen is your start screen. And that's what you need to define. And then you need to define your different composables in here that are individual screens, or that are supposed to be individual screens. Okay, so let's start with those points for our app. Therefore, in my fun my app, I'm going to set up this NavController and import remember NavController, as it's stateful again. So import this function, and then set up the NavHost. So NavHost, as we've seen, we need to pass a NavController, and let's import NavHost here. And that will be the composable NavHost. Here, let's say NavController is equal to NavController. So this is just a way for us to make sure that this is the right nav controller, like our nav controller that we set as the nav controller parameter. And then we need to say what the start destination will be. And I'm going to say it will be the first screen. Now, the first screen, while you might think it automatically understands that this is this first screen composable, but then you see the first screen has a different name. So we need to define those details. So let's set up those composables. So composables, you see here, the composable that it requires or it offers us is with a root and some arguments if we want those. So let's just start with that. Let's just start with the root, which will be our first screen. And then let's set up another composable, which will also have a root. And that will be the second screen. Now, you need to add curly braces after in both cases. Otherwise, it will crash. So you can do some more there. Basically, you see the two different ways of how you can set up a root, either this way or that way. Either way is fine. Basically here I'm specifically defining the root property here. It automatically knows if there's only one parameter that you're passing, then it will automatically be the first, the root, so to speak. Okay, so the composable function provides different parameters for setting up composed screens. And one is the root name, as we are using it here. And there's another is the composable itself. So the root can be used to identify a screen from anywhere in the app, just like we have set a start destination for the host. Before we call the different screens belonging to each composable, we will define the button actions for each screen. So in order to do that, we need to go over to our first screen here, for example. So we need to do two things in order to navigate from via a button from one screen to another. And that is, we need to pass the code or the function that we want to execute. And in this case, I'm going to use an anonymous function or a lambda. So navigation to second screen should be some code that I want to execute that will basically require no parameter and will return nothing. So we saw that before, right? This is basically saying, hey, pass me some code that should be executed whenever first screen is called. So we can pass a function or we can pass some code that we want to run, which requires no input and will give no output. It will just run some code. And then we need to call this function. So navigate to second screen inside of the button on click. And now I would navigate to the second screen with this. Now we have a little problem with our first screen preview. I'm just going to get rid of the first screen in our first preview because the thing is, we don't pass any code that should be executed here once the first screen happens. Actually, we could say nothing. So we could just say nothing should be executed for now. Okay, that's a way to get around it. And then the preview, well, we will need to build and refresh for this, but then we should still see our first preview. Or again, yeah, we do see it and it's all good. Okay. Now let's do the same thing for the second screen. Okay, so we move over to second screen KT and we say navigate to first screen here, which will require no parameter, but will also return nothing. So now let's call this navigate to first screen inside of our onClick. And then also make sure that in the preview, we just say don't do anything. Well, don't pass any code in there, basically. Okay, now inside of our main activity, inside of the NavController and our my app composable, which will take care of the navigation, basically, that's where we can now say what should happen as this composable first screen with the root runs. Okay, so I'm just gonna say here, I want to use my first screen, and the code that I will need to pass is going to be our NavController.navigate. And then I need to say to which route I want to navigate. And I'm going to navigate to the second screen route. So basically to this route here. Now that needs to be inside of parentheses, and that now allows us to navigate from one screen to another. So from the first screen to the second screen. Now let's quickly test this by going over to our main activity on create in the surface and actually use our My App, which is this composable that contains the NavHost that then contains the different composables, so the first screen and the second screen. So we don't need to use the first screen here. We're just going to use the NavHost composable, or the one that has the NavController NavHost, which basically takes care now of the entire navigation structure of our application. So now if we run this, we get to this screen. This is the first screen, and now let's click on this button. Now it sends us over to the second screen. Now, as we have not implemented what should happen with the second screen, which we need to do here. So basically we need to do the same thing here, and not say first, but second screen. That's why we got this error basically, because we need to pass something to second screen here, and we didn't do that, right? We didn't pass any code to it. Now we're going to do that just here. And let's rerun our application, and we should be able to jump from the second screen back to the first screen. And that was our goal. So let's go to second screen. You see, this is the second screen, welcome, and then go to first screen, and we're back to the first screen. So you see, we can now easily move between screens, but we're not passing the information of whatever we entered here yet, which we are going to do in the next video. So that's it for navigation in this video. See you in the next one.